One of the things that I have to dispute with you, and I say this respectfully,
good.
is you try to make the case that Stu Sutcliffe was a good bass player. And I know from having interviewed Pete several times, Pete has always defended Stu admirably as a friend. He has said to me numerous times, he wasn't a great bass player, he wasn't a bad bass player. He was adequate. He was good. He was good. But yet, you kind of suggest that Paul was eyeing for that position, and Paul has said many times that he was lumbered into that position. He didn't want it. The bass was not, a role that most people in a band wanted. It didn't become what bass playing became later on. It was simple bass playing for the most part, and he really didn't want to do that. And George Harrison didn't want to be the bass player. But the thing is that as far as playing bass is concerned, I've never heard it said from John, Paul, George, or Ringo, and even though he wasn't in the band when Stu was there, I'm sure he watched the group, that Stu was really good at all.
There's a difference between being adequate and being really good. Stu was competent, and for a lot of the songs they were playing, because I play guitar, playing bass guitar is really easy as a basic level. And for a lot of the rock and roll stuff they were playing, you can get away with 4 or 5 chords. Now, if you're playing the standard stuff in rock and roll, I was demonstrating this yesterday. If you're doing a rock and roll 3-chord song in the key of A, you do not need to put your left hand on the guitar. You play the open strings. It's not that difficult. And Stu was competent. And I think one of the clinching things for me was Howie Casey and the Seniors. They started as Derry and the Seniors.
Right.
When Stu stayed at the end of 60 and the rest of them came back to Liverpool, Stu played with Derry and the Seniors and with Howie Casey. Now, Howie Casey, of course, he went on, great saxophonist, played with the Wings, etc.
Absolutely.
They were one of the top groups on Merseyside, and Stu played bass with them in Hamburg. There is no way that one of the top groups would let Stu play with them if he couldn't play.
Good point. But I think from the point of view of Paul, who was ambitious, just like John was, he wanted the band to improve.
What was Paul's role in the Beatles at the time?
He was a guitarist.
And?
He played numerous instruments. At times he'd play the piano.
What was his defined role?
He didn't have a defined role, really.
And that is the problem. Pete's got a defined role, he's the drummer. John's defined role, rhythm guitar. George's defined role, lead guitarist. Stu's defined role, bass player. Paul's role, sometimes guitar, sometimes piano, sometimes vocal. What is his role?
The thing he was striving for the most was for the band to improve. And I've read a quote from Paul where he said other bands watched the Beatles perform with Stu playing bass, and they could tell he wasn't that good. And it was embarrassing. There's an actual quote from Paul saying that.
Oh, I'm sure there is, and there's quotes from other musicians that
and you could
Stu wasn't plugged in, he stood with his back to the audience.
Right.
I've never come across anybody who's verified that. Now, I know a lot of Mersey Beat musicians. I've spoken to a lot of them. And I was talking to Jeff Nugent from The Undertakers a few weeks back. And we got into the whole subject about Stu and about Pete. And I said to him, from everything I've been told, Stu was a competent bass player. Wasn't great, but he was competent. And he said, exactly. He said he could do the job. Now, what the Beatles went on to become, that was out of his league. But what they were doing at the time, Stu could cope with that, no problem. Now, it becomes, then you move on to the theoretical bit. And one of the things I found in researching the book was how much history was rewritten. Because once you've been there, you've got the success. In hindsight, you can justify things by what you say. And Paul has openly admitted he hounded Stu for a while, to the point where Stu quit before.
But did he do it because he wanted to play bass, or did he do it because he wanted the band to sound better and he wanted him to play better?
Open to subject, but you've got to say, I still think Paul's talent, he was the most talented musician in the group, but it wasn't a defined role. And I think with Paul's creativity, he could make any instrument sound brilliant. And in a way, I think he reinvented the role as a bass player.
Absolutely.
And he is a musical genius, and he needed a role. And I think, as you say, You can look at it from the point the group had to move on to progress, and Stu wasn't up to doing that. But at the time, for what they were doing, they were just enjoying themselves. They were still not thinking, we're going to take on the world. And I think that
I think in the back of Paul's mind and John's mind, they were always looking upward.
But then, if you look at their quotes in 63, they're still thinking, we might get 6 months success out of this.
That's how most musicians actually thought, because
Exactly.
because every rock star, the feeling was, you're only going to last a few years.
Exactly. So it's easier to look back in Hamburg and say, they saw they were going to become big and famous, etc. You've got to think of what was happening at the time, ignore what was happening in the future. When the Beatles went to Hamburg, as the Silver Beatles, their reputation was shocking. In Liverpool, they were a poor group. They were not well respected. They went to Hamburg because of Alan Williams, because he was looking after them. That's it. They were not there on musical merit. So all this going on in sort of late 60, early into 61, they were still finding their way. They were not at a good point. So ignore what's happened after that. At that point in time, they were not good enough really to get the top billing in Liverpool. So they're looking to progress is not, we're going to make a record and become famous. They're looking to progress is, can we get bookings, or do we go and have to get a job? And I think for what they were doing, it was good enough. I think Paul needed a defined role in the group, and possibly he could see that Stu was wavering between his music and his art. I think maybe the focus that Paul had is what drove the group on from the very start. I think it was a real driving force. And maybe he was thinking, well, if Stu isn't committed enough, that's not good for the group.